Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first New York 14 Community Project Funding webinar. My name is Michelle, and I'm the Constituent Services Manager for Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez. We're excited to offer this webinar to organizations in our district to provide an overview of our office's community project funding process and answer questions from you all. And then we can transition into our next slide. We'll just get started. If you come up with questions throughout the presentation, please submit them through the Q&A feature on Zoom. We will get through as many of them as we can at the end of the presentation. My colleagues and I will be available to answer any questions we can't get to live, and we will provide our direct contact information as well for any follow-ups. And just flagging, we're also joined by our Deputy Chief of Staff, Noreen. So what is community project funding? Every year, Congress is tasked with passing appropriations bills that dictate how federal dollars are spent. It is a process through which we fund the government, determine total funding levels across federal agencies, allocate specific funding levels for programs within those agencies, and determine which activities are eligible for federal funding. Community project funds, CPFs, also known as earmarks, allow members of Congress to authorize funding to go directly to specific projects in their district for that fiscal year. And now I'm passing it over to my colleague Diego, who will review expected CPF guidelines in more detail.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Diego, and I'm a legislative assistant for the Congresswoman, leading on appropriations in our DC office. So what you see on the screen right now are the eligible project categories. These are the appropriations subcommittees through which the funding was available last fiscal year, and which we expect funding will be available through fiscal year 2025. You can apply for funding in any one of these categories through the forms on our website, which are currently live. If you go onto our website, you can hit the Congress on the ribbon and drop down to FY25 appropriations, and you'll see all the forms there for the different project categories. Please feel free to reach out, though, if you have any questions on which form to fill out for your project or you're unsure where your project might fit best. I will note that in previous years, many of our projects have been funded through THUD, the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Fund, and the Commerce, Justice, Science, and Related Agencies subcommittees. Through THUD specifically, most of the funding was made available through the economic development initiatives. So that's things like food banks, youth and senior centers. We've had multi-purpose community centers. Also want to know that that's mainly for capital expenses. So programmatic and operational expenses are not eligible. Also wanting to flag that unlike fiscal year 2023, we don't expect any funding to be made available for projects under the Labor, Health, and Human Services and Education Subcommittee for the House, unfortunately. So moving on, our office broadly is limited to submitting for 15 projects across the entire district to the Appropriations Subcommittee, and the total amount of projects received or funds received for all projects across all members of the House cannot exceed 0.5% of all appropriations for any given fiscal year. I also want to flag here that CPFs are only eligible to nonprofit organizations, city agencies, and state agencies. For-profit entities are unfortunately not eligible to receive any CPF funding. A little bit more about internal selection process. We look for a detailed and well-planned proposal with diverse funding streams. The reason why we choose diverse funding streams, or that's a requirement, we just want to make sure that the project is viable. The House Appropriations Committee wants to make the project as viable. So they look for, diverse funding streams to make sure that the project can move ahead if you have less money that's appropriated, or if you end up not, basically the government just wants to ensure that you're not necessarily relying exclusively on CPFs for the project to be viable. Also wanted to note that to be eligible to receive this funding, if you are selected, a project must be able to use the full amount of money appropriated within one fiscal year or within 1 year when the funds are appropriated. In terms of community support, we have a field on our application forms where you can upload letters of support we request at least 2 letters of support from local officials or community-based organizations per project submission. That's just, again, to ensure that we have broad community support for these projects. So right now on the screen, you'll see here a selection of last year's community project funding requests. You'll see most of them really were through THUD, and they're pretty diverse. So we're looking at a Malika Center, the Northeast Bronx Youth Center, a food hub, and also a Flushing Bay Oyster Reef. So really, if you have any questions about kind of where the project might fit, please do feel free to reach out to our office, and we can do our best to help provide some guidance for you all there. Moving on to a little bit of what we expect the timeline to be. This is probably the most fluid aspect of the entire process. So please bear with us a little bit here. All of this is really subject to change. So last week, we launched our applications for the appropriations request for this upcoming fiscal year 2025. And while we have yet to receive like official guidance for FY25 from the Appropriations Committee, we don't have any reason to suspect that it'll be any different than previous years, or than at least than last year. So all of the guidance from fiscal year 24 is on they're all hyperlinked on our forms on our website. We do have a deadline to submit for our office at April 5th, 2024 at 5 p.m. Eastern. So that's roughly 2 Fridays from now. We just want to make sure that everything is submitted and ready to go so that when we do get guidance or we do have an official submission window, we can get a quick turnaround. So hopefully we can speed the process up a little bit. If there's anything that's missing between this week when you all apply, we'll be reaching out to you all applicants or for any additional materials or clarifications that we might need throughout the process. After the projects are submitted, we will notify all applicants when we do submit those 15 projects, and we plan to do that before the end of April. That being said, the committee hasn't really opened up any guidelines yet or any actual submission windows, so that date might be a little bit flexible, but right now we anticipate that this will be done by the end of April. In terms of what the next steps are after we submit for the project, that still has to get marked up by the committee. It has to pass the House. It has to survive negotiations between the Senate and the House, and then it has to be passed by the Senate as well. So even if we submit for 15 projects, that's no guarantee that those 15 projects will be funded. We won't really know what projects will be funded until we get a final bill text after the House and Senate negotiators are finished. Ideally, that happens before the fiscal year is over. However, as we have seen this last year, we submitted for projects in March of 2023, and we were not notified what projects actually got funded until a few weeks ago. So this whole process is unfortunately kind of subject to change, but we will let you know as soon as we know any changes in timeline or any sort of fixed goals here. And then finally, I will get into some of the like broad line restrictions here on funding. So unfortunately, funds cannot be used for memorials, museums, or commemoratives. However, museums can still apply for funding for specific projects, so long as it's not actually funding those, memorial museums or commemoratives. If you are a museum that's looking for funding, please feel free to reach out to us individually, and we can take those on a case-by-case basis and try to help navigate the process here. Additionally, all activities must have an existing federal authorization. So capital funding initiatives for the economic development initiatives, they're eligible under the Community Development Block Grant Program. That being said, we just can't create new authorizations within like the bill. We have to, those federal authorizations already have to exist, unfortunately. But yeah, overall, if you have any questions regarding, any step of the process, the form, where you think the best project for you might be, any questions at all, feel free to reach out to our office or contact myself. My email is there on the screen. It's just diego.delatorre@mail.house.gov. And we can set up a time to chat, or we can just communicate via email, whatever is easiest to you to answer any of your questions. So now I'll be passing it back over to Michelle for our Q&A.
Thank you, Diego. So yes, we're just opening it up to questions. We're at the end of our presentation, but of course we can review anything we went over afterwards. But if anyone has any questions, please use the Q&A feature and we'll answer as many as we can get to live. Our first question is, can we apply for CPFs from multiple representatives as we work out of several different districts within the Bronx and Brooklyn?
I believe you can, as long as the project, as long as you're submitting for different projects for each representative. I don't believe you can submit for the same project across 3 representatives. However, if you have 3 distinct projects across 3 distinct districts, yes, that is a possibility that you can do.
And I will also flag that although currently we are not accepting through the House any projects through Labor, Health, and Human Services Subcommittee, that may be an option through one of our senators. So you may want to look into that as well. And that ties into the next question, which is how do CPFs work in partnership with congressional district spending, for example, or for CDS through Senator Schumer's office? Diego, do you want to speak a little bit on that?
Yeah, actually, so it kind of does work in partnership. So essentially, if you can submit through, it just increases your chances essentially of that project getting funded. So if there's a specific project that you really want to get funded, you can submit both to the senator and to ourselves. And then usually there's a field in the forms, both on the Senate side and our side, that'll ask you if you had submitted for a project with a senator, or the senator will ask you if you submitted for a project in the House. And that just increases the chances of it getting passed through because you have a little bit more advocates. To answer your question, yes, it kind of does work a little bit in partnership, even though the processes are a little bit separate.
Thank you, Diego. And our next question is from Rachel. The question is, can we apply for funding for a community center that would include a halal food pantry and offer financial literacy classes, English classes, etc.? Yes, please do. It sounds like that would be eligible under the Economic Development Initiatives through our THUD subcommittee. So please do reach out to us if you have any questions on filling out the application or collecting any of the materials that we ask for. But financial literacy and all of that sounds exactly like the kind of economic development initiative that this subcommittee is looking for in this year's CPF. So we would love to consider that application. Our next question is from Emma. The question is, for the application budget, is there any documentation required to justify expenses, for example, quotes or estimates from contractors?
Yeah, I mean, any sort of documentation that you can provide would be really helpful, and that just strengthens the application. You don't necessarily need like a full line itemization of every single expense, but really the more specific that you can get with where that funding will go, that will be really helpful. And if you already have existing documentation that shows, sort of that specific amount requested, that just strengthens your application all the more. It's not a requirement per se, but it really does help, especially with the committee. And then I want to backtrack a little bit, Rachel, to your question here in terms of applying for funding. Definitely echoing what Michelle said, but it sounds like it'd be eligible for the Economic Development Initiatives grant. But this is a little bit just more broadly speaking, I guess, any sort of initiative that does that is for capital acquisition, so a community center or food pantry. We've done those things before, but right now with the current political dynamics in the House, we would just kind of encourage you all to really focus on the economic impacts of the projects that you're building out. So it would unfortunately not necessarily be enough to say like, oh, we are going to provide food for, X amount of people. That's great. That's phenomenal. Like we are 100% in support of that. But the economic impact, if you can really kind of quantify it as much as possible, it makes it a little bit easier for the committee to like fully see the ties between the economic development initiative process and that specific project. So that's a little bit more of a broader guidance, but whenever you are applying for that specific fund, we do just encourage you all to frame your applications in that way.
Thank you, Diego. The next couple of questions are just following up on the relationship between CDS, congressionally directed spending through the Senate, and CPFs, and about whether you need to be as specific in the CDS applications. I would say, reach out to one of our senators' offices regarding more specific guidelines on CDS, but, I can just imagine that as senators represent the whole state, they're a little bit more flexible about the requirements regarding location versus for CPFs, because our congressional districts, they're so kind of precise, and we don't cover the whole state or the whole city. We often just, would like to specify where in our district, just to make sure that this project is going to be for our, constituents and districts' benefit. Our next question is asking about the potential for applying for a composting operation.
On its face, it sounds like it would be eligible, but feel free to reach out to my email, and we can talk a little bit more about the specifics of that project. Theoretically, it doesn't sound like, just on its face, again, it doesn't really sound like it'd be ineligible, but definitely would need a little bit more context there.
And then just a follow-up question, asking if we can explain a little bit more about, providing quantifiable data. I think probably just going back to the economic development initiatives and how you can quantify that, how you can kind of show that it will meet the program guidelines.
So this is definitely a little bit of a tricky question, because sometimes it really can be really difficult to quantify, like the actual impacts that this project will have. But I think as an example that we tried to do last year, we submitted for a whole host of NYCHA improvements over a couple of NYCHA houses. And one of them was like elevator restoration, another one where we needed to provide playgrounds for the community. And it really was just kind of figuring out what research there's been done on like childhood development and the importance of playgrounds to contributing to like an economic space. And we were trying to build that argument as much as we could. It doesn't necessarily need to be bulletproof, but as long as you can show that there are quantifiable sort of economic impacts, so whether it be like there's increased traffic, or whether it be that like actually research shows that decreasing hunger means that people contribute more to the economy and they're more likely to go around, or financial literacy classes means that people will be more likely to contribute to the community again in some sort of monetary way, or like increase the basically develop the community's economy and make them a little bit more economically competitive. Those are just arguments that you should definitely include in whatever project that you're going through. This is again if you're going through the Economic Development Initiatives grant through the THUD fund.
Thank you. So next couple of questions from Emma. So for successful applicants, would contracts be reimbursable? For example, grantees providing documentation of expenses in order to receive funding, or would grantees receive all grant funds upfront? I can answer this. So for the most part, it's, these funds can't be used to reimburse for, money already spent for the most part. But that being said, we can follow up on a specific example with the Appropriations Committee just to determine how that fits into the plan for your proposal. And understanding, given that the timeline is so, not precise, it can be really difficult to plan around this federal funding. So we'd be happy to follow up with the Appropriations Committee with any other questions. And I think Noreen's gonna share a little bit more information as well. Another question is all work required to take place in federal fiscal year 25, if at the time of the grant award, the project is already underway, would grantees be eligible to receive funding for work that has already occurred?
Hi, I'm happy to jump in here, and I shared this as a written answer as well. But in the guidance document for Economic Development Initiative, which is the account that most of you will use if you're looking for some sort of community center, acquiring a space for some sort of build out or renovation, I'm going to drop the link in the chat as well. So please do take a look. But over on page 3, you'll see that soft costs are not eligible for reimbursement, but some hard costs may be. And in terms of when you're able to draw down the funds, you will be working with a grant manager from, if we accept your request, if committee accepts the request and it gets signed into law, the next step in that would be outreach from a grants manager from that agency, and you would work very closely with that grants manager to get all your paperwork in and figure out a timeline once all that paperwork is approved to start drawing down the funds. They do recommend, as a general guidance, that it be drawn down within FY25, but we have seen them be flexible around that should an applicant run into any hurdles or obstacles.
Thank you, Noreen. Next question is, so can we apply, so we can apply for the purchase of a community center space, but is there funding for staffing or for food for the pantry? So unfortunately, it's like specifically under this account, EDI under Transportation, Housing and Urban Development Subcommittee, there is only funding for these economic development initiatives like a food pantry, just for the capital costs, so not for programmatic or operational costs, unfortunately. So through the House, through the subcommittee, and this account would be just limited, unfortunately, through to just the capital costs, so acquiring the physical space. And I think those are all of the questions. We'll hold on another few seconds in case anyone else wants to share a question that we can answer. But of course, we'll be here to follow up with anyone one-on-one to prepare your applications. And just thank you so much, everyone, for your participation. So please reach out to our team if you want to talk through a potential submission and you have any project-specific questions in the next couple of weeks. We look forward to reviewing your submission. Thank you so much for joining.